Faithfully Catholic and Patriotically American. Today, on The Simple Truth, we consecrate everything to the Sacred Heart of Jesus through the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the pure, strong, chaste heart of St. Joseph. Our guest today is Dr. Robert P. George, McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. You can learn more about him and his good work at robertpgeorge.com. Professor George, great to have you back with us on The Simple Truth. How are you today?
Very well, and thank you. It's a pleasure to be back on your show.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being with us. Now, I know there are some people that when they have a free hour or two, love to find a fishing hole where they can throw a line in the water, and I get that. It sounds nice and peaceful. But for me, I prefer to head to a ballpark, be around the game of baseball, or find a bookstore and let our good Lord lead me to something good there. Well, he led me to something good a couple of weeks ago in a bookstore when I came across a periodical I had not heard of before, National Affairs, which included an article by our guest today entitled Catholics and the American Order. Professor George, you begin this article by writing, quote, "Since our nation's founding, American Catholics have confronted the question of whether one can be a faithful Catholic and devoted citizen of the U.S." You give a nod to the history of Protestant and more recently secular progressive concerns rooted in bigotry or perhaps misunderstanding. But that's not what this article is about. It's about, as you write, quote, "Catholics who share the belief that good Catholics cannot unreservedly affirm the principles of the American regime, a regime they see as defective from the standpoint of Catholic teaching." End of quote. You go on to say there are some Catholics who view separation of church and state, religious freedom, and other freedoms associated with democracy as, at a minimum, less than ideal. First, I want to thank you for taking on this view. It's not one that I've encountered directly, but as I read the article, it did turn some lights on for me as to where I may have encountered this indirectly. Folks that hold it in some form, they're thinking based on it, but they don't come right out and tell you this is what they think. In your view, is this a belief that is currently growing? How big of a problem do you see this as? And anything else you'd like to share by way of introduction today?
Well, thank you, and thanks for pointing out the article. I would commend the journal, National Affairs, to all of your viewers and listeners. It's a great magazine. It's written for a general, decently educated general audience. Most of the contributors are academics, but it presents articles by academics that are not just for academics. So it's not the sort of stuff that you would find in a typical academic journal, articles that are written for 200 other specialists in the field. These are articles that are written for any decently educated reader who's just interested in ideas, such as the question that you're discussing with me today. It's edited by the wonderful Yuval Levin, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and someone I've known for about 25 years, since I was serving on the President's Council on Bioethics during the George W. Bush administration. And Dr. Levin at that time was a member of the staff. He eventually became the staff director of the commission, and he himself is a wonderful scholar as well as a great editor. So I do commend the magazine to everyone. Now, you've asked me whether the perspective on which I was offering a critical view is widespread, and I do not believe it is widespread. I believe most American Catholics don't think that there's any tension or problem of any sort when it comes to being both a faithful Catholic and a loyal and patriotic American. But there has always been some element of the American Catholic Church that was less than fully comfortable with affirming American patriotism and a firm belief in the Constitution and the principles of American democracy. And one sees a bit of a revival with that today. I've seen it with some students, some young people, and especially young men. And they do a little research and they dig out some quotations from 19th and especially 19th, but also some 18th and 19th century popes that talk very skeptically about democracy. About separation of church and state, about religious freedom, about other basic freedoms. And I want to have an answer for those who dig up those quotations to the question, well, these are binding teachings of popes, right? So if we honor them as we should as faithful Catholics, then we're going to have to take a skeptical view of these principles that are so celebrated as part of our American heritage. So I wanted to say a word about that and explain the teachings of those 18th and especially 19th century popes in historical context.
Yes, yeah, and that's what we're going to get into. That's really the meat of this article that you've written here, which is terrific. But first, you write, quote, "For Catholic skeptics of the American regime, a fully just ideal state would reject these principles. Instead, it would recognize the Catholic faith as the true faith and declare Catholicism the nation's established religion. It would prohibit the spreading of religious falsehoods, that is, ideas that conflict with the teachings of the Catholic Church. In such a state, we would not resolve our political disagreements by allowing everyone to vote, but by obeying pronouncements from church leaders." End of quote. So as you call them, these Catholic skeptics of the American regime, they seem to want to throw out our democratic constitutional republic and throw in a theocratic Catholic monarchy. Is that, as you see it, what they're after?
Well, I wouldn't want to speak for them, and I'm sure that even among people like that, there are a range of opinions about what the ideal structure of the state would be. But it would not, for example, have separation of church and state, because they think that principle is actually condemned by authoritative teachings of 19th century popes. It would not be democratic in the way that our current structure is democratic. It would not honor religious freedom in the way that we, not only we Americans, but we Catholics are taught to honor religious freedom today, most especially by the document Dignitatis Humanae of the Second Vatican Council, the Council's declaration on religious freedom. For the kinds of thinkers and people that I'm engaging with here, the Second Vatican Council took a wrong turn. The teachings of the Council, especially in Dignitatis Humanae and in the teaching on the non-Christian religions in the document Nostra Aetate, deviates from authoritative teachings of the Church. And therefore, the standing of those documents in their minds, those conciliar teachings of the Second Vatican Council, the standing is up for grabs. It's debatable. It's uncertain. It may be that they don't have standing. I think they do. I think that they are authoritative conciliar teachings. They do, in some respects, certainly contradict previous teachings of some previous popes. I don't think that they contradict any teachings that were proposed ultimately authoritatively, indeed infallibly, by the magisterium of the church. If it were otherwise, we wouldn't really have a problem. But I don't think that they do, and that's why I try to explain the context of those teachings of previous pontiffs.
The contemporary magisterium of the Catholic Church expresses no objections to the separation of church and state as practiced in the United States. It also affirms the right to religious liberty, as well as the legitimacy and even the desirability of republican democracy. And then, so therefore, the view that wants to perhaps force a Catholic monarchy would be associated with those who, as you write, quote, believe that recent popes, beginning with Pope St. John the 23rd, led the church down the wrong path. I'd even tend to go a little further than this, I guess, and in light of what you write, suggest that it's probably most likely a view held not by those who merely believe that recent popes have led us down the wrong path in some ways, but rather those who outright reject the validity of the Second Vatican Council and the validity of all the popes since, which is a schismatic heresy known as sedevacantism. Nevertheless, this is where we get into the real meat of the article. You ask, are they right to suggest that pre-conciliar popes condemned ideas like democracy and religious freedom wholesale, that discontinuities exist between older Catholic tradition and the teachings of the Second Vatican Council and the post-conciliar popes, and that the American project is fundamentally irreconcilable with traditional Catholic political and social doctrine. As you say, these are not theoretical questions. Catholic parents and Catholic schools, among others, must decide what to teach young people about the American founding and the constitutional order and about our rights and responsibilities as citizens of this nation. Then you do a great job of steel manning the argument, addressing it head on, taking a closer look at the teachings of the preconciliar popes, as well as the teachings of Dignitatis Humanae, to help us find answers. Please, we'll probably only have a couple minutes here before the hard break, but at least begin sharing with us some of the important historical backdrop that you lay out in the article.
Yes, I'll be happy to do that. First, though, I want to say this. It's certainly true even today, of course, that there are certain interpretations or understandings of, for example, separation of church and state that are incompatible with authoritative Catholic teaching. So we have to make sure in affirming the compatibility of separation of church and state, for example, with Catholic teaching, we're clear on what precisely the understanding of separation of church and state is that's compatible with Catholic teaching. The one that's compatible with Catholic teaching is the one that says the institutions of the state are to be separate from the institutions of the church, such that no one holds political office in virtue of an ecclesiastical appointment, and nobody holds ecclesiastical office, say as a bishop, in virtue of a political appointment. There are polities, cultures, and societies in which you don't have that separation of church and state. But that understanding of separation of church and state is perfectly compatible with the Catholic teaching. What's not compatible with the Catholic teaching is an understanding of separation of church and state that would separate religion from public life, or tell religious people that they cannot act on their religiously informed and inspired convictions about justice and the common good in the legislative or political domain. That understanding of separation of church and state is just utterly incompatible with Catholic teaching to this day.
Yes, very important distinctions here with Professor Robert George. We're going to be right back with more. Stay tuned.
Did you know you can help evangelize simply by using your cell phone? The Station of the Cross is partnering with iCatholic Mobile, America's only Catholic mobile phone company. When you join iCatholic Mobile, a portion of every dollar will support our programming. Plus, you'll enjoy great service with iCatholic Unlimited 5G data, text, and talk. With iCatholic Mobile, you can stay connected with family and friends while also spreading the truth of Jesus Christ with clarity and charity. Join today at iCatholicMobile.com.
Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with Dr. Robert George. You can learn more about him and his good work at robertpgeorge.com. We are talking about his article entitled Catholics and the American Order. You can find it in National Affairs, the Winter 2025 edition. And getting more into the historical context here of this argument that we're discussing today, you cite Pope Gregory XVI's 1832 encyclical letter Muriari Vos, and then also Pope Blessed Pius IX, his 1864 encyclical Quanta Cura. And then you say, basically, look, folks can find this stuff, right? You can sort of cherry pick these things and, to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. Somebody coming across this can say, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't quite sound like what the church is teaching in Vatican II and following. However, you say, look, this can be a temptation. You can find these two preconciliar popes here denouncing in no uncertain terms religious freedom and the separation of church and state. But what these critics overlook is the fact that Popes Gregory and Pius did not pen these encyclicals in a vacuum. They wrote them in response to specific events, especially you get into here the French Revolution. Can you explain this for us?
At the time of these writings, so in the early to mid 19th century, the apparatus of the church, the leadership of the church, was largely European. Indeed, it was largely Italian. But the point here is that it was largely European. The church has since, in its administrative structure and its leadership, been very significantly internationalized. If you happen to spend some time in the Vatican today, you'll think you're in the United Nations. There are bishops and cardinals from every land on earth and every region who are present. But it's a largely European church. And what was the major, most significant European event that focused people's thinking at this time? Well, it was the French Revolution that began in 1789, leading to the Reign of Terror, the murder, the mass murder of priests and nuns, terrible atrocities committed against them and against faithful lay Catholics as well, the denunciation of the church's teachings on fundamental matters of faith and morals. And this is what shaped the consciousness of European leaders, including European church leaders, of Europeans generally, in this period. Now, the French revolutionaries had certain ideas that they labeled, for example, separation of church and state, religious liberty, democracy, and so forth. And so when those phrases were used in that period, to the ear of again, European church leadership, those connoted beliefs, practices that were and are to this day utterly antithetical to Catholic teaching. They conjured up the image of the French Revolution. So what's the French revolutionary understanding, for example, of separation of church and state? Well, it's not the one that I articulated a moment ago as being compatible with Catholic teaching, where the institutions of the church and the institutions of the state are separate, such that no one holds political office in virtue of an ecclesiastical appointment and no one holds ecclesiastical office in virtue of a political appointment. No, rather it was the subordination of the church to the state. The state is above all, including the church. The state essentially comes to have control over the church. The church's autonomy is compromised, and thus its integrity is damaged, as you see in countries that have infiltrated or taken over the church leadership. It happened in Russia. It happened under the czars, and it happened under the communists, and it's happening under Putin today. Well, of course, this is utterly incompatible with the Catholic understanding of things. And so in condemning the separation of church and state, that is what the popes were condemning. Now, they did not have in view an alternative understanding of separation of church and state that did not subordinate the church to the state or give the state all power over the church. Similarly, with the concept of religious liberty, what did the French revolutionaries mean by religious liberty? Well, they meant that, for example, there is no religious truth, or all religions are true, or all religions are false, or that no one should take religious vows because they are something by which we try to bind ourselves against future changes of minds, or the taking of religious vows is immoral. That was their understanding of religious liberty. And with that understanding of that phrase, religious liberty, in mind, of course, Catholic leaders, popes and others, would condemn it. That's incompatible with the Catholic understanding. But it's very different from the understanding of religious liberty that is articulated and endorsed, embraced in the document Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration on Religious Freedom of the Second Vatican Council, which argues that faith by its nature is free and cannot be coerced, and that the dignity of the human being requires that governments and everyone else respect the freedom of the individual to make the act of faith, that it cannot be coerced, he cannot be forced. In fact, any attempt to force someone to believe will simply introduce the evil of inauthenticity, false living, believing one thing in your head while acting differently in your external actions into the person's life. It's damaging, not helpful, to try to coerce religious faith. And the document goes a step further than had been gone by previous documents or papal teachings in the Catholic Church. And it says that the dignity of the human being requires not only that we be free to make the decision, to perform the internal acts of intellect and will that are the substance of faith, to make the decision about believing or not believing, but our dignity also requires that we be free to express to others our beliefs, even if those beliefs, as it happens, are incorrect. We're nevertheless entitled to argue with other people, to present our views to other people, to engage other people, to make our case, even if the case we're making is contrary to what the Catholic Church itself teaches. So as you can see, this is a very different meaning of the words religious liberty from the meaning of those words religious liberty in the minds of the French revolutionaries, and therefore in the minds of the 19th century popes, who, when they heard the term religious, or the phrase religious liberty, it would mean for them, what it would connote for them is the French revolutionary understanding.
Yeah, extremely helpful. So you can see how someone of goodwill could go back and read these encyclicals from the 19th century, and then read, Dignitatis Humanae and other documents from the Second Vatican Council, and moving forward, and say, hey, these don't line up, because they're not thinking about how there's various definitions of these same phrases or words, and also not thinking about the historical context. So you can't just look at just the words on their face. There has to be some understanding in order to really interpret what's being expressed in that older encyclical, and then what's being expressed in the Vatican II document and going forward. So very important to have this parsed out here in this article. And then you say, look, it's not just the French Revolution. This problem continued on, because one could say, look, these encyclicals are from 1832 and 1864. That's after the French Revolution. But as you make the point here, you say, look, the effects of these attacks did not stop with the fall of the revolutionary government in 1799. In the decades that followed, the doctrines of French revolutionary ideology continued to fester, even within the church. Both Gregory and Pius were forced to contend with prominent French Catholics, among both the clergy and the laity, who publicly and persistently argued that French revolutionary principles and ideology were reconcilable with Catholic doctrine. So this battle was going, it spilled even into the church. You say the predominant ideology of the French Revolution was Jacobinism. Can you explain a little bit more, I guess, about this and the historical context even going forward into the 19th century?
Sure. So the dogmas of the French Revolution included the idea that everything that had gone before the French Revolution was just fundamentally unjust, fundamentally wrong, fundamentally oppressive. So we needed to begin from scratch, from year one. And the Catholic faith, which had been the historic faith of France, of course, gets demoted, worse than demoted, comes under severe attack. And for avant-garde French revolutionaries, it's replaced with what they call the cult of reason, or the religion of reason. So they distinguish faith and reason very sharply in order to deprecate and denigrate faith as superstition, as something backward from a terrible previous time. And now we're going to start as if this is day one with a new faith, a new religion. And it's going to be the religion of reason that does not have the traditional components of Christian faith, and specifically for the French, of course, Catholic faith. This understanding of the relationship of of faith and reason, one that sees faith and reason as fundamentally in conflict, fundamentally antithetical, is itself antithetical to Catholic teaching. The Catholic teaching is, and always has been, that faith and reason, far from being in tension or in conflict, are complementary. Many years after this, of course, Pope John Paul II would write a wonderful encyclical summarizing the Church's historical understanding of the relationship of faith and reason and reasserting it. And it would be entitled, the encyclical was entitled, Fides et Ratio, in other words, faith and reason. And he would open that encyclical with a wonderful image. He says, faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit ascends to contemplation of the truth. And he goes on to argue that both wings are needed. Faith without reason gets you into trouble, and reason that's the error of what's called fideism, and reason without faith, what might be called the error of rationalism, also gets you into trouble. Just as a bird can't get off the ground and into flight without both wings. I don't know if you've ever seen a bird with a wounded wing. I grew up in the hills of West Virginia and hunting and fishing, and I know what it means to wing a bird where you've injured one wing, but the bird's still living and one wing's really working. But it'll be down there on the ground trying to fly, and he'll be flapping the good wing, but it doesn't get him off the ground. He just goes around in a circle on the ground. That's what happens. You need both. And that's John Paul's point, that if we're going to get at the fundamental truth of things, we need faith and reason both, and working together harmoniously in a complementary fashion. So you can see how different, again, that is from French revolutionary ideology, which denounces, degrades, deprecates, denigrates faith in the name of reason, the cult of reason. Notre Dame Cathedral, I should put it rather, to distinguish it from the American University. Notre Dame Cathedral is hijacked and turned into a kind of cathedral for the goddess of reason.
Oh, yeah. Look, this is another area that young people especially, we need to be training them up rightly, right? I think there may be a bias against even teaching the truth of the French Revolution in many public schools, and maybe even Catholic schools aren't really teaching this much anymore. But what an important historical context to understand. This is vastly important, not just for that time period, but to see how things have played out down to our day. Ramifications still continue. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with Professor Robert George. We are talking about his article from National Affairs, Catholics and the American Order. You can find it in the winter 2025 edition of National Affairs, and I do highly recommend it. We get to as much as we can here on the show today, but there's no replacing an actual reflection on what is actually written here in its entirety by the author, which I, again, just highly recommend. So much in here that is so helpful. And we talked a little bit, you shared a bit about Dignitatis Humanae. I think maybe redeeming it in the minds of some. I think there are many fair questions to be asked about when you read through some of the documents of the Second Vatican Council, and you think, this sounds, a bit different from what was taught earlier. But again, the historical context matters, the definitions matter, what is really being expressed. All of those things have to be thought through very carefully, and maybe a difference in emphasis in various ways that could be ultimately, I think, fairly viewed as problematic, possibly in some cases. But at the same time, we do know Pope Benedict XVI talked about this, not so much a problem with the documents of the Second Vatican Council in and of themselves, but really the implementation or even a sort of hijacking of the implementation of them and what came in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council. Again, Pope Benedict XVI, I think, speaks of this with great clarity and charity on the topic. But you write of Dignitatis Humanae, really what a sound document it is in many ways. You say it rejected understandings of religious freedom based on the view that all religions are equally true or untrue, and the belief that religious truths is a purely subjective matter. It rebuffed the liberal idea that religious freedom is to be justified as a necessary means for maintaining social peace and stability in the face of entrenched religious pluralism. It also spurned the claim that religious liberty is an abstract right grounded in personal autonomy, or a concept of fairness floating free of any consideration of the human good. These arguments all incline to varying degrees towards some form of public and governmental agnosticism concerning the ultimate or integral well-being and fulfillment of human persons, what in academic political theory goes by the label anti-perfectionism. Instead, Dignitatis Humanae grounded the importance of and the right to religious freedom in the role it plays in enabling and facilitating the sincere and earnest truth-seeking in spiritual matters that all persons are called to undertake. So this does seem quite good and sound, and appreciate you bringing this all forward to our attention. I think there probably are likely many who have never read Dignitatis Humanae in its entirety, or even some of it. It's been a long time since I've read it. So I guess just to say that this is sound. Anything else you want to say about the document itself and what it teaches, and the fact that, as you already spoken of some here about the problem of coercion, right, which is the alternative. If you don't give people the freedom to come to these truths in their own understanding, if you try to force it upon people, we've certainly seen throughout history, throughout church history, when you try to force people into the faith, force conversion, it doesn't really work that way. The effects are very bad. Anything else you want to say on it?
Yes. Thank you for reading that material. You brought out my points very well. I do think we have to gratefully acknowledge, that Dignitatis Humanae does contain some development of Catholic teaching. It's not simply a restatement of Catholic teaching. Some fundamental teaching is restated. For example, it's always been taught by the Catholic Church that faith, to be authentic faith, must be free. That a coerced faith, whatever else it is not faith. That if someone goes to church, for example, goes to Mass because they're forced to go to Mass, then that's not an expression of faith. That faith is not the external behavior. It's the internal acts of intellect and will that are the substance of faith. So there's some restatement of traditional Catholic understandings, but then building on those traditional understandings, there's some development. For example, the Church did not always teach, which it now does teach in Dignitatis Humanae. Here's a development that the dignity of the human being requires that the human being be free to articulate his beliefs, his religious beliefs, his beliefs about spiritual matters, his beliefs about human nature, the human good, human dignity, human destiny, even if his beliefs happen to be out of line with the beliefs of the Catholic Church. In previous times, the Church would authorize and sometimes even call for the power of the state to be used to punish people for spreading beliefs that they held that Catholicism regards as unsound. That is now repudiated. And so people have the right not only to believe, but to express and even try to persuade others of their beliefs. I think the Church has, in its mature thinking here, arrived at the understanding that the truth has nothing to fear from free debate and discussion. On the contrary, the luminosity of truth, what again St. John Paul the Great would call the splendor of truth, is such that if the truth is allowed to be articulated in a fair debate, its splendor, its luminosity, its authoritativeness will be clear to people. So all the Church now asks for is freedom, just the freedom to articulate her position, to evangelize, to offer her perspective in fair terms of discussion with anybody who wants to contradict it or present some kind of alternative.
Dr. Robert George is with us, robertpgeorge.com. And also, on the other hand, you do say that religious freedom is not absolute. Dignitatis Humanae recognizes as much, noting that religious communities rightfully claim freedom only as long as the just demands of public order are observed. And in fact, under the Constitution, government may legitimately restrict religious freedom when a failure to restrict it would imperil the common good. If, for instance, a neo-Aztec cult wanted to practice human sacrifice, even if it was supposedly consensual, to please a sun god, the government could and surely would prohibit this practice and would do so without violating the principles outlined in Dignitatis Humanae. Anything else on this?
No, that's the point. That it's a substantive, stringent right, but it's not a right that is unconstrained or unlimited. The state has the legitimate authority to forbid some practices. I'd use the example of infant sacrifice. You could use the example of burning widows on funeral pyres. You could use lots of other examples. The state has the legitimate authority to restrict those things, even in the face of sincere belief, where people sincerely believe that, for example, to protect themselves against the wrath of the sun god, they've got to sacrifice a virgin or an infant or whatever. Even if you had a willing girl, let's say you had a willing young woman who was willing to be sacrificed, 14-year-old girl to the sun god, the state could still legitimately forbid that. Nobody's right to religious freedom includes the right to practice human sacrifice.
Yes, and getting towards the conclusion here, you say the state, if it is doing what Dignitatis Humanae requires, is promoting the common good. It is creating the conditions of integral human flourishing. You say the Constitution, while admittedly not citing a precise philosophical basis for the free exercise of religion it defends, does not found or sustain its free exercise protections in the French revolutionary doctrines condemned by magisterial authority in the 19th century. Indeed, a responsible and charitable interpretation of our Constitution would not result in the conclusion that the rights it protects are somehow incompatible or irreconcilable with the Catholic doctrine. And that you say the pronouncements of Gregory XVI and Pius IX include no condemnations fairly applicable to our Constitution or our nation's founding principles. And since the conclusion of Vatican II, there have been many papal endorsements of the principles of American civic life and our system of republican democracy. Pope St. John Paul II was particularly effusive in his praise for what he described as the American democratic experiment. Anything further on this?
Yeah, something important to say, I think, Jim, and it's this. When John Paul, for example, came to the United States, he had several visits with us. And when he was here, he never said, America, you need to change your principles. America, you need to reform your principles. America, you need a new set of principles. He never said that. What he did say was this: America, your principles, your constitutional principles are sound and true and good. What you need to do is be faithful to them, be more faithful to them. Where you've deviated from them, get back on track. Don't abandon your principles, live up to them. And that should always be our aspiration as Americans. For as long as this republic endures, our aspiration should be to live up to the good and true and noble principles of our tradition.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's it. And yeah, getting to the question that you raised earlier in the argument about what are we to teach our children, you say the answer is clear. American Catholics must teach our children to understand our country's history, cherish and maintain its founding principles, and recognize that when we have gone wrong as a nation, it has been on those occasions when we have acted in defiance of those principles or failed to honor them. We should teach young Catholic men and women to value our Constitution because the freedoms it protects allow us to pursue truth and goodness. They nurture and sustain our families, our communities, and our country's civic order. And we must affirm to our children and our students that there is no reason to feel they must choose between being faithful Catholics and being patriotic Americans. How important that is that one really understands that and believes it, to be able to free them of, I guess, any sort of feeling of conflict here, and to understand exactly as you're saying, as you cite Pope St. John Paul II, that we really are free to do both, be faithfully Catholic and patriotically American. Anything else, Professor George?
Just no conflict there. Our country does not ask us, when it asks us to affirm the principles of our Constitution, to do anything that's incompatible with our faith. Quite the contrary. In demanding, for example, respect for religious liberty, as the American constitutional tradition understands religious liberty, not as the French revolutionary spirit understands religious liberty, our country is not asking us to in any way compromise our Catholic faith, because a sound understanding of religious liberty, one that is in line with the teachings of Dignitatis Humanae in the Second Vatican Council and the teachings with modern popes like Pope John Paul II and like Pope Benedict. That understanding of religious liberty is entirely compatible with the principle of religious liberty as it is, for example, enshrined in our Constitution.
And you conclude as follows: if this nation under God, as Abraham Lincoln put it in his Gettysburg Address, is to endure, we must continuously pray and work to ensure that our laws and our leaders truly honor that North Star principle of all sound morality, that of the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. Now, we can clearly see where this is being violated today in terrible ways. I think none bigger than the ongoing daily mass murder of our littlest brothers and sisters by abortion, and also IVF now coming into view. People able to really see what's going on there. It is not pro-life, and to really get into all of that. So there are terrible violations against human dignity, even while our Constitution is there and under our form of government. But to your point, what you're saying is what that means is, look, we have a form of government where we can go to the public square and convince people, and that is what we must do. And this is why we need a virtuous people for this flourishing in this form of government. Otherwise, it can go the wrong way. Anything else to say on that?
Principles are not self-enforcing. We have to make the decision to live by them, to honor them. We will never live up to them, Jim, perfectly. Not in this vale of tears, not in our frail, fallen, fallible condition. We'll never live up to our principles perfectly. We didn't from the beginning. Thomas Jefferson articulated on behalf of the founding generation that great principle. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But that very Jefferson upheld slavery and himself was a slave holder and did not, unlike Washington, did not manumit his slaves, even in his will. So we lived with a contradiction of our fundamental principles all the way back at the beginning. Now we eventually, with much struggle and much profound witness by many, many people, including, of course, the great Reverend Martin Luther King, we were able to overcome many of those racial injustices. Well, today we are in the same situation. We're facing other injustices like the ones that you just put on the table, grave, serious injustices, just as slavery and segregation and Jim Crow were serious injustices. And we have to fight back in the name of and for the sake of our principles, just as we did on those racial issues.
Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with Dr. Robert George. RobertPGeorge.com is where you can go to learn more. And Professor George, I guess, there's a great segue here from this article, the need to be both faithfully Catholic and patriotically American. And I would say not even, necessarily faithfully Catholic, but to be a person of goodwill who believes in truth rooted in natural law. Everybody ought to be able to see a common sense idea here about the fact that, since at the beginning of our lives, we're all that size once. We all do have that, those inalienable rights. When do those inalienable rights begin? It would make sense that it begins when we begin, right? And so we even do see in the 14th Amendment, as it speaks about persons, that every person has equal protection under the laws, and that's already there in the Constitution in the 14th Amendment. You write about this extensively. You put together a great amicus brief with John Finnis during the Dobbs case, and appreciate all of that good work that you do in that area for sure. But this is an area where we do need to push forward here. I guess, what is your sense, in this time that we're in? It seems to me that there's an opportunity right now with the Trump administration in the White House, them saying that they're open to common sense ideas and a sense to say, look, can we get this question before the Supreme Court so that they, will be forced to actually look at it and rule on it? It seems that they don't really want to. But if President Trump were to sign an executive order on presidential personhood, the Lincoln proposal, as it's been called by some, this would probably have it in the Supreme Court pretty quickly, and they'd be forced to deal with this head on. Is that a strategy that you like, or how else are you seeing the moment before us right now?
Well, unfortunately, President Trump has made very clear that he does not see this as a federal issue. He rather has retired to the position, if I can use that verb, retired to the position of believing, or holding at least, that this is purely a state issue, so that each state will have to make its own policies as to when embryonic and fetal human life can be protected. I was not a person who trusted that Donald Trump would be faithful to his original position back in 2016. Well, it wasn't his original position. He originally declared himself to be very strongly pro-choice. And then when he decided to seek the presidential nomination of the Republican Party in 2016, declared himself to be pro-life and ran on that platform. He also, during that campaign, seemed entirely open to having federal protection for unborn human life, but he's now abandoned that position and now takes the view that it's purely a state issue. He's washing his hands of it. The federal government has no role in it. So my own view is that Congress should enact legislative protection of unborn children. I don't think that it's purely a state issue. I don't see how it could conceivably be purely a state issue, given that the 14th Amendment, as you say, empowers the national government. This is Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, to protect the basic rights, including the right to the equal protection of the laws articulated in the rest of the 14th Amendment, where states fail to do so. And of course, all the liberal states are manifestly failing to do so in the case of the child in the womb. So the case for congressional action seems to me overwhelming, despite President Trump's representations that he now believes that it's a state issue. So we're going to have to keep the pressure on. And then there's the IVF thing. And President Trump has, when he declared himself to be the father of IVF, he's behind it 100%. He's got an executive order trying to push IVF along. During the campaign, he claimed that he would either have the government pay for it or compel insurance companies to pay for IVF procedures. And as you know, and as I hope your viewers and listeners know, IVF, at least as it's practiced in the United States, involves the mass creation and then, of course, either freezing or destruction of human beings in the embryonic stage of human embryos. So it is entirely incompatible with pro-life principles. And nevertheless, President Trump has endorsed it. I would like to get a case before the Supreme Court that would give the court the opportunity and indeed force the justices to examine the argument that Professor Finnis and I made in our amicus brief in the Dobbs case about the 14th Amendment's protection of unborn children. And our case there, Jim, as you know, is that the original public meaning of the 14th Amendment in 1868 clearly included unborn children. And we bring an avalanche of evidence to bear to establish that case. The court dodged the issue in Dobbs, and it would be good if they were forced to actually confront it and say whether we're right or wrong. I'd love to have a decision from them about it, but they've got to confront the evidence and tell us, if they don't think the evidence is conclusive, why the evidence is not conclusive. It certainly seems to me that it's utterly conclusive.
Yeah, we're definitely in agreement there. And admittedly, I do agree as well that it's a long shot with President Trump for the reasons that you state. At the same time, I think it's probably also very much a long shot right now with Congress, maybe even more so. But I guess how else is it possible to force the Supreme Court to deal with this question? It'd be great if they would just be willing to and take it up. It is their job, after all. It says equal justice under the law, I believe, outside the court there. But it seems they don't have a willingness to do it. If they do need to be forced, it seems clear at this point. What about a governor or some other executive somewhere in the country who signed an executive order on personhood or simply said, I'm going to start to follow the law based on the 14th Amendment? Any other way that you perceive there could be a way to trigger the Supreme Court to have to take it up?
A governor can't do it. The governor's jurisdiction is only within the state, and President Trump himself acknowledges that the states can legislate in this area. So that's not the question. The question is the authority and obligation of the national government, the federal, what we call the federal government, to do that. And no governor can force a president's hand on that. As far as the Supreme Court is concerned, really for all intents and purposes, I could get into some detail and nuances, but really for all intents and purposes, the Supreme Court today has discretionary jurisdiction. They don't really have to hear any case. It is very hard to come up with a way to force them to take a case. They can always simply refuse or decline to grant what's called certiorari. That is, to review a case coming up from a lower court, whether the lower court is a state Supreme Court or whether it's a U.S. Court of Appeals for one of the judicial circuits. So we're we're really in a fix here, in a jam, those of us who want the Supreme Court to actually confront the evidence that the original public meaning of the 14th Amendment did include unborn children. But we just have to keep thinking and working. And while at the same time, working within the states where, since the demise of Roe, we're now entitled to working within the states to bring state protections.
I appreciate all that you do and all the good work. In fact, I have seen the Fox News article talking about how you're part of this new venture to shake up messaging with big investment from these key players in the pro-life movement. It names you along with Ray Ruddy, Leonard Leo, David B. Wright being the chair here. Can we expect that this initiative is going to help educate in a big way the grassroots, the folks in the country on personhood? Is that going to be a big part of it?
Yeah, we're certainly going to do all we can, bringing all the resources we can develop to bear to educate the public on this issue. There's still a lot. It's hard to believe that after 50-something years, there's still so much widespread misunderstanding of the question, but there is. And so the public education is going to be a big part of what we do.
Well, thank you very much for your great work. Thank you for this article in National Affairs. Greatly appreciated. You are a great gift to the church and to the world, Professor Robert George. Again, robertpgeorge.com is where you can find him. Thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure, Jim. Thank you.
All right. Again, you can find this article in National Affairs, the Winter 2025 edition, Catholics and the American Order by Robert George. God bless you all.